Here's the Soviet Union as the powerhouse of its time.
On October the 4th, 1957, while the Americans were still finalizing their plans, Sputnik was launched.
Of April 1961, a Soviet Air Force pilot, Yuri Gagarin, became the first human to blast into space.
And here is the Soviet Union after its spectacular fall in 1991.
Russia was in the middle of a constitutional crisis when the president, Boris Yeltsin, ordered the army to shell Moscow's White House, the building housing parliament, on October 4th, 1993.
The number of gangs exploded tenfold. The mafia eagerly filled the power vacuum the fall of communism created.
Is Vladimir Putin determined to take the Russian Federation down a disastrous path? From Ukraine's war map to Russia's energy crisis, it seems that Putin may be repeating the same mistakes that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. With tensions high and issues unresolved, this video will shed light on what is really going on. So, make sure to watch until the end. Russia seems to be on the same path as its predecessor, a road to ruin. Putin's so notorious he's more public enemy number one than Kim Jong-un was last year. But, funnily enough, it's the same old thing that brought the old USSR to glory that might be bringing down Russia today. Yup, it's oil and gas. They're causing quite a stir in Euroland. Sweet, sweet oil with a sour taste. The European Council president even tweeted about it. We must comprehend Russia's internal dynamics in order to understand its current situation. As you watch this video, you'll see how the oil crisis has spawned a financial crisis and a crisis of foreign policy. One may contend that the oil and energy crises is the primary cause of the majority, if not all, of Russia's issues. So let's explore further. The Soviet Union left behind a lot for Russia to inherit as a state. The Soviet Union's supremacy in the energy sector was the major thing it eliminated, inheriting a number of pipelines as well as sizable oil and gas resources that were formerly on Soviet soil. This gave the states an advantage to maintain their dominance against the Soviets in the energy sector. And ever since, Russia has dominated the world's energy markets. Numerous analysts have compared Russia to an oil business with a CEO president. John McCain, a former US senator, has gone so far as to claim that Russia is merely a gas station pretending to be a nation. And although it may seem unpleasant to say it, Russia's global power and dominance have always depended greatly on its ability to produce oil and gas. Putin is perfectly within his rights to describe Russia as a global energy superpower. Russia is a major player in the global energy market. It competes with Saudi Arabia and the United States for the top rank among the top 3 producers of crude. The amount of crude and condensate produced by Russia in 2021 was 10.5 million barrels per day, comprising 14% of the global supply. Picture it, 14% of the global supply from one country? Talk about having everything. It's not just oil either. Russia also has gas. In fact, they're the world's number 2 producer of natural gas and have the largest reserves too. They're also the biggest exporter, with a lot going to China and Europe, who rely on Russian gas for 45% of their imports and 40% of consumption. So Europe depends on Russia for energy, but at the same time, Russia depends on them for major cash flow. And that's where the problems start to set in, and we see parallels to the Soviet Union. You see, Russia is too dependent on this oil and gas, not like Saudi Arabia, who diversified their economy after they struck oil. This makes their GDP and domestic spending vulnerable when prices drop or exporters lose market share. Hydrocarbons are essentially holding up modern Russia. No wonder Senator McCain called them a gas station masquerading as a country. When you look at their revenue streams, it's clear why. Oil and gas make up 60% of exports and 45% of budget revenues. Man, oh man. Check out this graph from Statista. It shows the share of the oil and gas industry in Russia's GDP from Q1 2017 to Q2 2022. Hydrocarbon energy has ranged from 15 to 25% of their GDP, and nearly half of that is exported to Europe, with the rest going to Asia. So yeah, Europe's highly dependent on Russian supply, but it's also true that Russia relies heavily on European money. I mean, how can they not be, when 60% of exports and 45% of budget revenues come from commodities? This over-reliance on one sector is serious business for Russia. If anything, it's accelerating them towards collapse. And one thing we've learned, sadly, from the Soviet Union is that oil prices can be volatile. Low oil prices in the 2010s meant lower oil revenues for Russia, leading to reduced plans and budgets since their economy is so dependent on hydrocarbons. The US and Saudi Arabia are a little better off in this regard, as they have other sectors boosting their nations up, giving them extra capital even in high oil price years, something completely out of reach for Russia right now. Russia has long been known for its abundance of oil reserves, but it has not been able to take full advantage of them due to a lack of innovation and weak incentives for companies to develop new fields. This means that Russia is still relying heavily on inefficient water pressure extraction in Soviet legacy reserves. In addition, 2/3 of new reserves have unconventional oil that requires new technologies and large capital investments to extract, thereby limiting the growth of Russian production systems in comparison to their counterparts. The situation is further complicated by Russia's high tax rate, chaotic regulatory system, and official distrust of foreign companies, particularly from the West. These barriers have made it difficult for Russia to collaborate with foreign oil companies and exploit its Siberian fields, resulting in limited output and revenue. Compounded with the fact that the sector is heavily dependent on international relations and good foreign policy to foster better trade relations, Russia's current situation is far from ideal. Putin's 2014 military exercise in Ukraine brought US sanctions knocking on Russia's door and tanked their oil revenues. The European Union's move to green energy has been eroding Russia's hydrocarbon advantage with no end in sight. It begs the question, what good is a wealth of abundant resources if everyone is powering up with clean energy? In an all-out energy crisis and a Ukrainian whoops exercise, it seems like Putin forgot he was living in the 21st century. I wonder, just how often do military exercises call for tanks and troops?
Full-scale invasion that intelligence officials had been warning about for weeks is now underway, and there are reports of explosions and attacks at several major Ukrainian cities, starting in the city of Kiev.
After the U.S. warned all day of a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, that it was imminent, Vladimir Putin has just addressed the Russian people moments ago, announcing what Putin called the start of a military special operation.
More than 2,000 civilians dead in the first week of war with Russia, say the Ukrainians, and further casualties to come as cities across the country come under intensified attack.
People tend to overlook that Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year was so much more than a political battle. Deep economic relations, fueled by oil and gas, muddy Moscow's already not so clean motives. Of all the former Soviet republics, Ukraine has it made. A sizable population, plus its own oil and gas infrastructure, it was vital for Russia to transport their hydrocarbons through Ukraine to Europe. Depending on the geopolitical leaning of Ukraine's government, is it pro-Russian or pro-Western, decides how big a stake Russia has in a country. But Putin and co. have never really been thrilled about having the pipelines run through someone else's backyard. Over the years, Ukrainian-Russian disputes over transit fees, for use of their own export hub, have only added fuel to the fire that has increasingly strained tensions between them. And with Ukraine strategically placed to control Europe's gas hub, as well as its long history of being part of the Soviet Union, these tussles about price tags also gaining geopolitical significance. Putin's timing of disputes with Ukraine has led many to suspect that he may have been seeking to divert attention away from the struggles of Russia's oil-based economy, a once reliable source of revenues that underpinned cheap gas and other public benefits. A closer look at Russian history reveals economic slumps coinciding with disputes in 2006, 2009, and 2014. It's no wonder they needed a diversion. Each conflict has seen Moscow take some rather drastic measures. Let's zoom in on each individually. In April 2005, Putin shockingly increased gas prices to Ukraine by more than threefold, a decidedly unreasonable move. As a result of this, Russia eventually decreased their supply of gas to the Ukrainian hub, leading to lower pressure and reduced flow to several European nations for 3 days in 2006. Come January 2009, and Putin cut off the Ukrainian supplies completely for 12 days, causing millions of Europe's people to freeze without heat for weeks. Luckily, EU mediators were able to negotiate talks. However, it's worth noting that the timing was not random. It coincided with low points of oil and financial crashes that had thrown Russia into an economic malaise. Fast forward to 2014, after a pro-Russian president was outed by Ukrainians, Putin's military annexed Crimea and supported separatists in the Donbass region, resulting in hefty criticism from international communities, although they'd been aware that the Crimean offshore gas fields could potentially undercut Russian business by tens of billions if sold to Europe. Though one cannot be sure if this is why they invaded Crimea at the time when Ukrainian politicians were exploiting their reserves as a way out of relying on Russian imports, it seems rather suspicious. All of Russia's aggression has not gone unnoticed or unpunished on the international platform. Following the 2009 gas dispute, the EU decided to push back against Putin's fossil fuel dominance by introducing regulatory and judicial actions that reduced Russia's influence in oil and gas sales in Europe, a clear attempt to reduce Putin's power in this energy sector. It seemed whenever Putin threw a temper tantrum, something had to be done. The EU's third energy package set out to reduce corruption and create a comprehensive climate policy. Unbundling was one of these rules, which prohibited a company from having control over both infrastructure and fuel, targeting Gazprom directly, Russia's largest state-owned multinational energy corporation. Consequently, several raids took place on their offices in September 2011. In 10 different countries within the EU, Gazprom then faced charges for levying higher prices from vulnerable countries like Bulgaria and Poland, who were notably pro-West. A difficult situation indeed. Yeah, take a look at old sly Putin. He faced potential fines of up to 10 billion euro, leading several EU countries to invest in a new gas infrastructure to reduce reliance on Gazprom. These changes had a huge impact on their profits, as well as money entering Russia. The EU then set new climate rules that were met with great disapproval from Moscow. Many of them included green measures that would decrease payments and imports to Russia in favor of clean energy. In the end, this would affect profits for Russian aluminum and steel exports, which generally have higher carbon footprints. Remember when I said Europe is a major Russian customer and hydrocarbons make up 45% of Russia's budget? That certainly didn't help the situation, as it probably fueled Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and only made Europe hate them more. So where does this leave us now? The EU has imposed heavy sanctions on all things Russian, and each member state is planning to phase out Russian oil and gas. This means, although it may not look like it yet, that Russia is in big trouble. Europe's suffering from the pushback doesn't mean Russia isn't hurting too. They'll soon face reduced revenues and are likely to be relying solely on Asian markets. Europe's had enough of being pushed around, and invading Ukraine was an unforgivable sin for which they'll pay with their economic life. With the lack of European markets, Russian revenue is set to drop. This would heavily impact around half of Russia's budget, leading to domestic tensions, and Putin won't be able to have his normal tantrums of hiking prices either. The US and its European allies have imposed a cap of $60 per barrel on Russian oil, in an attempt to slow down revenue flow to Russia. This cap is intended to keep Russia pumping oil, helping with global supply, but restricts windfall profits going towards funding war in Ukraine. Those importing Russian oil are now able to take advantage of Western shipping, financing, and insurance only if they pay at or below the $60 mark, essentially cutting off the teeth of Russia. The fall of the Soviet Union looks like a prelude for what's happening in the world today. With Russian exports decreasing, keep watching our videos and don't miss out on what might be the start of a major international shift.